Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar brought to you by the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. I'm Dov Waxman, the director of the Nazarian Center, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers for today. Our main speaker is Derek Penslar, who is the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History at Harvard University and a resident faculty at Harvard Center for European Studies. Professor Penslar has also taught at Indiana University, the University of Toronto, and Oxford University, where he served as the inaugural Stanley Lewis Professor of Israel Studies. He is the co-editor of the Journal of Israeli History, president of the American Academy for Jewish Research, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He is the author of too many books to mention, but his latest book, which is what we will be hearing about today, is Theodor Herzl, The Charismatic Leader, that was published this year by Yale University Press as part of their Jewish Lives series. And I'm happy to let you know that you can receive a 25% discount on the book and free shipping if you purchase it on the Jewish Lives website using the code Herzl. After Professor Penslar has talked a bit about his book and about the subject of his book, Theodor Herzl, he'll then be joined by David Meyers for a conversation about the book. David Meyers holds the Sady and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA, where he also serves as the director of the Luskin Center for History and Policy. He previously served as the chair of the UCLA History Department and as director of UCLA's Center for Jewish Studies. Professor Meyers is also the author of numerous books in the field of modern Jewish intellectual and cultural history, his most recent book being The Stakes of History on the Use and Abuse of Jewish History for Life, published by Yale University Press in 2018. Since 2003, he's served as the co-editor of the Jewish Quarterly Review, and he's an elected fellow of the American Academy for Jewish Research and the Los Angeles Institute for the Humanities. So we have with us today two of the most outstanding and preeminent historians in the field of modern Jewish history, experts on Zionism, and it's really a great pleasure for me to introduce both of them today. Before I hand over to Derek, I'd like to invite you all to send us your questions. You can submit them using the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screens. So send in those questions, and we'll have time at the end for me to read some of them aloud and for Professor Penslar and Professor Meyers to answer your questions. So without any further ado, I am delighted to introduce Derek Penslar. Thank you.
Thank you, Dov. You can hear me all right?
Yes.
I hope everyone can hear me all right wherever you are, all over North America or maybe beyond, in this very difficult and unusual time. But I'm very happy that we can meet virtually. So thank you, Dov, very much. Thank you, David, for being part of this conversation. I'm very appreciative. I want to talk a little bit for about 15, 20 minutes max about the book, a little bit first about how I came to it. We do have a lot of biographies of Theodor Herzl. Mine is hardly the first. There are maybe 10 serious academic biographies of him, and then many, many books about him in different forms. Every era creates new ways of thinking about the past, and that includes how we think about great leaders in the past. We've had many biographies of George Washington, or of Abraham Lincoln, or of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And it stands to reason that there would be multiple biographies of Theodor Herzl, who was, from an organizational point of view, the founder of modern political Zionism. He was also an inspiring figure who became a symbol of the Zionist project. And although his life was short, he died at the age of 44, he accomplished tremendous things. He was what the philosopher Hegel has called a world historical figure. And we think about the Jewish past today, we think about the state of Israel and the Zionist movement today differently from the way we did in past eras. And biographies of Herzl that were written in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, the last great biography of Herzl was written at the end of the 1980s, were asking different questions, and they were looking at the past in different ways. One thing I try to do in this book, for example, is to rise above extremes of either hagiography or revision. Early biographers of national leaders in young states are often hagiographic. They might be full of information, very useful information, but they're really more about the symbol than about the man. But then there comes a point, perhaps later in the history of a state, where people become more critical, They're looking at the past in new ways. And we saw in the 1970s and 80s in Israel, books about Herzl exposed his darker side, his weaker sides. And this was part of an attempt to perhaps rethink, reevaluate some of the simplistic notions upon which Zionist ideology had been based. I'm trying in this book to rise above that. We're in the 21st century now. We're very comfortable living with gray, living with hybridity and complexity. And I've tried to bring some of that to the book. Another thing I'm trying to do in the biography is to present the story of a man who cannot be separate from his environment. That the study of leadership, by definition, demands that we look not only at the human being, who is the leader, but at those whom he or she would lead. That is, it's a dialogic process. And the book is very much about that dialogic process between Herzl and his following. For the most part, but not exclusively, Eastern European Jews. And so the book does deal a great deal with Eastern European Jewish perceptions of Herzl, often not entirely positive perceptions. And that's something I try to bring to the book, the dialogic quality of leadership. But let me talk a little bit about Herzl the man in the few minutes I have for this introductory section, because he was a complicated man. And although the book, much of it is about his organizational work and his leadership and so forth, it is rooted, as all biographies must be, or should be, in the story of a human being. One thing to keep in mind is that Herzl was the ultimate, really the quintessential European. He was born in Budapest in 1860. He was raised in a bilingual home. He spoke Hungarian and German with equal fluency. But from the age of 6, when he began to write to his parents, his first letters to his parents were written at the age of 6. Dear father, dear mother, how are you? I am well. Love, your son, Theodor. But he wrote it in German. But he did talk to his parents. At times, at least, he used Hungarian endearments. But clearly, he spoke German at home. And yet he spoke Hungarian in the street. He went to school in Budapest until 1878, when the family moved to Vienna. Now, this is the beginning of a multilingual, cosmopolitan human experience. He learns French at school. He moves to Paris in his 30s, but by then he's already absolutely fluent in French. So he's really, to all extents and purposes, trilingual. He speaks very good Italian, and although he never mastered English, he spoke it very well. Herzl was comfortable everywhere in Europe, that is the Western world, and he was very much a cosmopolitan in that environment. So Herzl can be explained as a product of a German cultural sphere with Vienna, which he's most closely associated with, but I would actually call him a great European, a quintessential European, with all of the pluses and all of the negatives that came with being a prominent and prosperous and successful European in the late 19th century. Another aspect of his life I want to emphasize is his Jewishness. Herzl is often described as being from an assimilated home. The word assimilation is, I think, a badly chosen word. It has connotations of escape from Jewishness, of living without knowledge or in ignorance of one's Jewishness. One thing we can be sure of, if a Jew is growing up in Budapest or Vienna in the 1860s, 1870s, and beyond, the one thing they are never not aware of is their Jewishness. It can be expressed in a positive sense through engagement with the Jewish religion or Jewish culture or Jewish politics. It can be engaged with simply through exposure to anti-Semitism. But however you define it, Herzl knew that he was Jewish. His father himself had been raised in an Orthodox home. His father had had a traditional Jewish education, the mother much less so. Herzl attended what we would call today a Jewish day school. That's not what they called it back then. But he did go to a Jewish school in Budapest when he was young. He learned a smattering of Hebrew, not much, and he retained it just as much as, say, many young Jewish children in Los Angeles today retain the Hebrew they learn when they're 10 years old. That is not much. But he certainly grew up as a Jew. He didn't have a bar mitzvah for the simple reason that there was a cholera epidemic in Budapest at the time. So there was a ceremony at home. He received bar mitzvah gifts, one of which was a book of Bible stories about Moses. and the parting of the Red Sea and other miraculous things that entranced the young man. Now, I don't want to exaggerate about this. There are some Israeli scholars who come from the national religious movement who have tried to reclaim Herzl as a great religious figure because of this smattering of Yiddishkeit he had as a child, and because of certain references he made in life later on to Judaism. Herzl was secular in the sense that he did not believe in the Jewish God, he did not keep the commandments, he was not observant, he celebrated Christmas until well into his adult life. When the chief rabbi of Vienna, Moritz Gudemann, came by to see Herzl of a December after Herzl had begun to talk about Zionism, the rabbi found Herzl decorating the family Christmas tree, and Herzl did not understand why this was a problem. But Herzl was definitely aware of his Jewishness. The question is, how did he deal with it? Well, when he got to university, he did what a lot of young men do. He joined a fraternity, and he spent a lot of time drinking beer and doing what fraternity young men did at that time, which was fighting duels. He had his sword, he fought in duels, as was the custom at the time. There's a picture of Herzl as a student with the dueling scar that he has received as a sign of initiation, and a piece of sticking plaster on his face. And he affected a German, exaggeratedly German nationalist identity when he was in his late teens and early 20s, an attempt to compensate for the anti-Semitism, which was quite pervasive. Herzl encountered anti-Semitism through his professional life, as briefly as a state attorney, and then as a journalist, and more on that in just a second. The point I want to make is that Herzl always knew that he was Jewish. The question is, how was he going to deal with it? Many Jews of his era were exposed to anti-Semitism. Very few became Zionists. So anti-Semitism is a necessary, but it's not a sufficient precondition. Third thing I want to mention about Herzl's biography, which is sad. He was an unhappy man. Herzl, even as a child, had a certain tenseness about him. He was a bit of a loner. He appeared aloof. He loved very few people. He loved his parents. He was very close to his parents through the rest of his life. He loved his sister, his older sister, Pauline, who died tragically when Herzl was 18, and he never really got over it. He never got over her death. He had very few friends in his life. He had a couple of close friends when he was an adolescent, and those close friendships are the kinds that usually last later into life, but they both died tragically, one by tropical disease and the other by suicide. So Herzl was a lonely man. And in later life, as a journalist and then as a Zionist activist, he had colleagues, he had lieutenants, but he did not have confidants. He did not have friends. And that is not uncommon for great leaders, that they feel themselves to be apart. And Herzl was very much like that. He was unhappy as well in his marriage. He married at the age of, he was 26, she was 18. She came from a good family. It all looked good on paper, but it was not a happy match. Herzl was a deeply, in some ways, a dark, he had men of dark moods. He struggled with depression. And he never really got away from his mother's influence, and the relationship between his wife and the mother-in-law was very difficult. Herzl himself found, and we only have his side of the story because unfortunately her letters were lost during World War II. We have his side of the story, that she was difficult and demanding and not mentally stable. Again, we're only hearing his side of things. I think Herzl himself was not an easy man at all to be with. The unhappiness of the marriage led them almost to the point of divorce on several occasions. This is not just salacious gossip. This really matters in understanding why Herzl as a human being was looking for something in his life that would give him meaning, that was something more than the humdrum pleasures of domesticity. And then that leads us to how he would find that meaning. This is a man who craved success. And Herzl looked for it in different venues. When he was a teenager, he began writing for newspapers. He was publishing in newspapers in Budapest and then Vienna already in his late teens. He had a gift for journalism. But Herzl never respected journalism. He was one of the most prominent journalists of the late 19th century. He would go on to become the Paris correspondent of the Neue Freie Presse, the most prestigious newspaper in Central Europe. Herzl would then be the literary editor of that newspaper from 1895 until his death. But he never really respected his journalism. He wrote beautiful political journalism, on cultural affairs. He was a master of a certain literary form called the feuilleton, an extended essay, an observation, or a short story. He was a master at it. And he also wrote short stories that had real artistic value, mixed in with a lot of frankly mediocre stuff. But Herzl didn't respect the journalism. What he wanted was to be a great playwright. And Herzl wrote many plays. Sometimes he's described as a failed playwright. That's not fair. He did succeed. His plays were performed in Prague and Berlin, New York, and even in Vienna, at the most prestigious theater in Vienna, the Burgtheater. But the plays were wooden, light, drawing room comedies. You see, Herzl as a playwright, he didn't yearn to understand human beings. He did not want to recreate a reality, an imagined reality. He didn't burn with the desire to express himself the way that great artists can. He simply wanted to be successful. And his plays had a limited appeal, and in time, their quality deteriorated. By 1895, he was in a state of crisis. His professional career was not giving him what he wanted. His marriage was not giving him what he wanted. Anti-Semitism, I mentioned earlier, was growing. He had been exposed to it in Paris at the time of the scandal over corruption in the company that was building the Panama Canal. He was exposed to it during the arrest and trial of Alfred Dreyfus, although the influence of the Dreyfus Affair on Herzl is often exaggerated. He was exposed to anti-Semitism in Vienna, much worse and worse with time, as an avowedly anti-Semitic mayor. As an avowedly anti-Semitic individual, Karl Weger was seated as mayor of the city in the mid-1890s. Herzl was a man by 1895 in his mid-30s in a state of crisis. And then he entered into a period of frenzy. I am not a psychotherapist, and I know that there are psychotherapists and there are people with training in psychoanalysis, including Peter Lowenberg from UCLA, who has written important work on Herzl, who have written on Herzl from a psychobiographical perspective. I can say that Herzl entered a period of frenzy, of perhaps delirium, and one might diagnose it as mania that lasted for several months, in which he began to write furiously about dreams for how to solve the problem of the Jews. At times, he wrote with great lucidity, and some of that material, which he then edited and cobbled together, became his pamphlet, The Jewish State, in 1896. So I've talked about Herzl as a human being, because really to understand the man who was a great Zionist leader between 1896 and 1904 when he died, we have to understand those first 35 years, between 1860 and 1895. They don't explain everything that came after, but they are essential, because ultimately a great leader is a human being, and in the case of Herzl, a complex one and a flawed one. So I just wanted to provide that kind of background, and then as our time goes on, we can talk more about Herzl as a Zionist leader, about what he meant to the Zionist movement, what the Zionist movement meant to him, his successes and his failures, and so on. 2:20, okay.
Excellent, Derek. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be in conversation with you, with a friend and colleague and expert on both Zionist and modern Jewish history. I'm really grateful that, Derek, you undertook this assignment for the Yale Jewish Live series. It is true that you're not the first person to attempt a biography of Herzl, but you have added a distinctive voice, and we have a richer picture of the man, particularly the inner life, as you highlight in the book itself, as well as the external forces that shaped him. It strikes me as a really appropriate moment to revisit Herzl, both the book and this conversation now, because at the micro level, on the Jewish and Israeli ritual calendar, we find ourselves situated between Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, between Israeli Memorial Day with the echoes of Mount Herzl and Israeli Independence Day. Or if we zoom out a little bit more, between Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and Israeli Independence Day, which I think really reflect the two major narrative strands of 20th century Jewish history, or at least two of the most major, which is the narrative of tragedy, of destruction, and the narrative of rebirth and triumph. And so, an interesting question to pose is, what is the emplotment, to borrow Hayden White's famous term, that we would use to describe the history of the state of Israel? Tragedy or triumph, or perhaps both? And I think that question assumes even more urgency in the current era. We find ourselves in the midst both of the corona pandemic and, I would say, an epidemic of illiberal democracy, as the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has described the era. It's important to note that Viktor Orban is friendly with and an ally of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel. And I think we can trace similar anti-democratic trends in both countries over the last decade or so, as part of a larger global scourge of illiberal democracy that extends from the Middle East to, dare I say, Washington, D.C. And so I guess this brings me, Derek, to this just brief contextualization of circles of moments that encircle our conversation. What would Herzl say about this? What would he say about this moment? What would he say about the state of Israel at this moment? So I want to, in a certain sense, move us to where you didn't take us at in your presentation. We'll, of course, have time to get back to those first formative 35 years, but let's move to the end, to the themes addressed in that last chapter of yours, the view from Mount Herzl. Herzl, as you observed well, was not a particularly devoted advocate of liberal democracy. He was a product of his time. I often say of Herzl, you could take him out of Europe, but you couldn't take Europe or Central Europe out of him. He had a very hierarchical view of things. He imagined the state of the Jews, of which he dreamt, as an aristocratic republic, probably based on his model of the idealized version of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in which he was raised. And so in light of that, and in light of all that's transpired over the course of more than a century, would he recognize the state of Israel as resembling the vision he laid out in 1896 in Der Judenstaat, in the book that's often translated The Jewish State, but perhaps more appropriately or correctly should be translated The State of the Jews? Would he recognize Israel today? Would he admire it? Would he feel that it was the realization of his vision?
That's a question maybe best answered by novelists and playwrights, people who dream for a living, like Herzl himself did. There was a play at the Gesher Theater in Jaffa a couple of years ago called Herzl Says, based on a popular Israeli children's game, which is sort of like Simon Says in English-speaking countries, in which Herzl's remains are being disinterred from Vienna, where he was buried, and they're going to be taken to Israel in 1949, and they're going to be reinterred in Israel on Mount Herzl. And Herzl, as they dig up the coffin, comes back to life. There he is, with the frock, with his evening dress and his top hat and the beard, and he is alive and kicking. And he describes to the Israeli military officials who have come to carry his remains back to Israel his vision of what Zionism should be. And he describes the world of his novel Old New Land, which was published in 1902, which is a utopian vision of a society that is truly democratic and that has no army and that has no borders, and so far as we can tell, has no difficulties whatsoever dealing with its neighbors. And this vision is quite different from what the state of Israel, even of 1949 was, let alone 2020. And the Israeli military delegation sent a cable to the prime minister, what should we do? Herzl's come back to life. Ben Gurion writes back, you are to fulfill your assignment, bring his bones back, or bring his body back to Israel. And so they make him, they force him back into the coffin, and they take him off to be buried in Israel. So that's an artistic way of answering your question, which is that there are many aspects of contemporary Israel Herzl would find dumbfounding, he would find disheartening. And there are other things that he would admire very much. Herzl was very much a technophile. He loved technology. He would admire the ingathering of the exiles, the immigration and absorption of millions of people. He would admire the infrastructure of the country, its rail system, its roads. Herzl actually, he was very much a dreamer. Herzl envisioned superhighways, freeways, and cars already in the late 1890s. He also invented, or in his mind, he imagined air conditioning. That's featured, I think, in his novel, Old New Land. So he would have been very happy with the technical side of things in Israel. I mean, seriously, the idea of startup nation, although it can be exaggerated, this would have appealed to him very much. The medical and other technological, breakthroughs that are pioneered by citizens of the state of Israel. He'd admire this. But I think there is more about Israel that he would find dismaying. The tensions between Jews and Arabs. Herzl himself had complicated views about Arabs, and we can talk later on about his views about the Palestinians, which are extremely complicated because they're almost non-existent. But Herzl does envision, and you mentioned an idealized version of the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, he does envision a society in which people get along, in which people of different ethnicities and different religions treat each other with respect and as equals. And that is something that he would find about contemporary Israel that would disturb him. But I think your question was really about democracy. And you're quite right to raise the fact Herzl was not by nature a Democrat. When he was 14, he founded a literary society of which he was president, and made sure that he would be its president. I mean, he had a kind of authoritative and even authoritarian personality all through his teens and 20s. When he founded the Zionist movement and when he held the first Zionist Congress, he was very much the man in charge. And I mentioned before, he didn't have friends. He had lieutenants and he had allies. And if you weren't his ally, you were his enemy. Herzl was not a man you'd want to cross. The Zionist Congress was not run democratically in the fact that he founded it, he was the president of the Congress and then president of the Zionist organization. It's also true that the executive of that organization consisted largely of sycophants. Having said that, there's a big difference between being an adherent of liberal democracy and respecting the rule of law. Herzl respected the rule of law. There were regulations in the Congress. There were ways in which things could be moved forward or moved back. Proposals had to be discussed and passed. So much of the internal development of the Zionist organization during those brief years from 97, the first Congress, to his death, were carried out in a remarkably procedurally elegant and formal and proper way. Herzl respected the rule of law. He was also incorruptible. Herzl never took a penny for his Zionist work. He sustained his family as a journalist and by relying on his own parents for funds and, much to his wife's dismay, spending down her dowry. But he never took a penny from Zionist funds, from the Jewish people. And this was a point of honor for him. Without getting too contemporary here, let's say that there are certain politicians in today's state of Israel who might not live up to Herzl's standards for honesty and propriety and incorruptibility.
Thank you for that.
So no, he wasn't a Democrat in maybe our sense of the word, but he respected the rule of law. He respected financial propriety. And at the end of the day, to finish up, he did respect the majority opinion of the Zionist Congress. In 1903, he proposed with great excitement an offer from the British government to settle Jews in what was at that time known as was British East Africa along the Uganda Railway in what is today Kenya. And Herzl saw this as a diplomatic achievement for Zionism, even if it did not mean a state in the land of Israel. But Herzl received a lot of criticism for it. And the story of what happened diplomatically is complicated, but the point is that Herzl bowed to the will of the Congress. And in fact, after the Zionist Congress of 1903, which debated this issue, Herzl figured that he was on the verge of resigning as president, that he'd done everything he could do. So this was not a man to launch a palace coup. This was not a man who disrespected democracy. And like I said, he respected the rule of law.
Okay, thanks for that. And there's some issues that you raised that we'll, I hope, have a chance to go back to. But I want to go back to the question of what role Herzl played in the State of Israel, in the creation of the State of Israel, and the foundation of the State of Israel as we understand it. You mentioned this image in the play of Ben-Gurion manifesting some measure of anxiety and fear that Herzl himself would return. And if we think of the political history of the State of Israel, we can divide it into two unequal halves. The first 30 years dominated by the Labor Party, the next 40 or so dominated by the Likud, with 8 or 9 years of exceptions. And when you think of the leadership of those two parties, Ben-Gurion and now Netanyahu, though of course Begin initially in 1977, certainly Ben-Gurion and Netanyahu, one doesn't think of them as the purest disciples of Herzl. So I'm wondering, in understanding the reputation of Herzl as really the founding father, not only of political Zionism, but of the modern State of Israel, what part do you think he actually played? What significance do you attribute to him in the creation of the state itself? Many lay claim to him.
Right.
From many different directions. What do you, on the basis of your analysis, see as his role in the creation of the state as we know it?
I suppose his role is to have been someone to whom many can lay claim, because Herzl fashioned himself as a symbol. Labor Zionists who claim that they represent some continuation of Herzlian Zionism are wrong. Herzl was not a social democrat. Herzl wasn't a socialist. He admired capitalism. He admired Walter Rathenau, the great German Jewish industrialist. Herzl did not believe that inequality between classes could ever be fully overcome. He was a liberal in the sense that he wanted the state to, and he wanted the private sector to do a great deal more to help the poor and the disadvantaged. But in this sense, he was a paternalistic liberal. He was not a social democrat. And in that sense, labor Zionists who claim his legacy it's not entirely accurate. On the other hand, maybe economically, Herzl would have been closer to the tradition of Herut or of Gachal, and later on Likud, that is the Zionist center-right, which believed in the virtues of capitalism. I mean, economically, Herzl probably would have been closer to Jabotinsky and his successors than to labor Zionism. But politically, I think it would have been very different in that, for example, regarding territory, Herzl never fetishized territory. The revisionist Zionist obsession with all of historic Palestine, 2 banks of the Jordan, this sort of thing left Herzl cold. At first, he was indifferent as to where the Jewish state might be. He considered Argentina, which at that time was a site for small-scale Jewish settlement. He considered the land of Israel. He decided on the land of Israel largely because he realized that to the extent there was a Zionist movement already on the ground in the mid-1890s, these people were devoted to the land of Israel. And Herzl, being a good politician, knew how to respond to his following. The land of Israel it is. But he is very unclear in all of his writings about borders, about where exactly the state should be. And also, unlike Jabotinsky and Begin and the revisionist tradition, Herzl was not even wedded to the concept of sovereignty. He wrote a pamphlet called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, but he was negotiating with the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, whom he met on several occasions, to create a province within the Ottoman Empire in which Jews would perform military service for the Ottoman Emperor and would be Ottoman citizens. But then he would also go to the German or the British governments to ask for a protectorate in Palestine. But he didn't really talk with anybody about a sovereign state. And this is one of the other confusing things about Herzl. The man who writes a book called Der Judenstaat is actually negotiating for anything except a state during the brief years of his activity. So he didn't fetishize the state the way that the revisionists, the way that many of the revisionists did. He didn't care that much about borders. Maybe in his secularism, his approach to religion, because he was secular, although not disrespectful of religion, maybe in this sense closer to revisionism. But you see what I'm saying is that neither camp really can claim him legitimately. What Herzl did is he created an image of himself through his appearance, through the institutions he created, like the Zionist Congress, the Jewish National Fund. These are all organizations that in German we would call unparteilich, non-partisan. They stand above the political fray, and he did that on purpose. He created institutions that embodied his charisma and that lived beyond him. And then different parties lay claim to him, but none of them would be completely right.
So just trying to sort of get at what role he played in the developments that would be realized in 1948. Would you say that one of the achievements was according legitimacy to a movement that was really a creation ex nihilo, that provided that first foundation of legitimacy, upon which subsequent international acts like Balfour and then the mandate added? I'm just trying to assess where we fit Herzl into the history of the state of Israel per se.
Well, again, he dies in 1904.
What do you think?
Right, but he dies in 1904. And the real question is whether, had Herzl not lived, those events that you're talking about all would have simply happened as they did. So the Zionist movement at the time of Herzl was quite weak. It wasn't well organized, and it didn't have a presence. It didn't have a visible center, which Herzl gave it. Now, it's feasible, it's possible, that had there been no Herzl, Zionism would have limped along in a much reduced form, lower profile, until World War I, at which time Chaim Weizmann, professor of chemistry or lecturer in chemistry at the University of Manchester, and a man known to the British War Cabinet, a man who had a charisma and leadership ability of his own. It might very well be that he would have cultivated those same connections, that he would have achieved the same thing in the Balfour Declaration, and that the history of Zionism would have moved along just as it might have, even without Herzl. That is possible. But I do suspect that, as you said, Herzl created the image. He created a center for the movement. He gave it a face, and he gave people hope. And one of the themes of the book, after all, in the title, The Charismatic Leader, that this is a man whose charisma gave Jews the world over, scores of thousands, even hundreds of thousands, a feeling of pride and hope. And without that emotional connection, that energy, it might very well have been that the Zionist movement would have dissolved during the following 10 to 15 years. And that Chaim Weizmann would have not only operated largely alone, I mean, him and a small circle of individuals, but that he wouldn't have had a public to report to. And I don't have a definitive answer. And because it is possible that Herzl's role in the creation of the state of Israel long run was less than one might think. But I believe, as Herzl himself believed, there's great meaning in symbolism. Yeah.
Yeah. National movements typically had great symbols to accompany them, including human symbols, as well as other forms of symbolic representation. So I want to ask maybe two more questions, one of which is going to dwell again in the realm of the contemporary, and in trying to assess the legacy of Herzl to complement your introductory words, and ask about the Arab question. You alluded to it at various points in your opening, and ask whether we can attribute any responsibility to Herzl for his opacity in addressing or failing to address the Arab question, namely the presence of an overwhelming majority of Palestinian Arab residents of Palestine. We know that there were Zionists in his time who were acutely aware of the Arab question, Chada'am and Emet Me'eretz Israel from 1891, Yitzhak Epstein in 1907, as you know well. Herzl was not among them. He was a man of his time and milieu of Central Europe, a German imbued with typically paternalistic, colonialist attitudes towards the Orient. He came to Palestine with mixed feelings, as you bring in a diary entry, and he didn't really register the presence of the local population. We might say that he was so consumed by the Jewish question in Europe that he couldn't really see the Arab question. And I'm wondering, what do you think of that? But even more, do you think that his opacity played any meaningful role in the attitude of Zionism towards the Arabs and the larger conflict? To take one example of an affirmative response to this question, as you know, Rashid Khalidi, in his new book, The 100 Years' War, believes that a reference by Herzl on a diary entry in 1895 about squiring away the local inhabitants of the land to which the Zionists will make their way was an indication of the deeply colonialist nature of the Zionist project from Herzl's time all the way forward. So I'm wondering how you read that opacity and whether it was simply a product of its time or in fact had echoes and reverberations in Zionism and the State of Israel thereafter.
Well, that's an interesting phrase, to be a product of your time, because that's not an excuse. One could say about late 19th century anti-Semitism, well, it was in the air. They were a product of their time. The fact that anti-Semites were a product of their time does not justify their anti-Semitism. So to the extent that Herzl was opaque in understanding native Palestinian resistance to Zionism or their own collective existence, to the extent that he and his peers felt a natural European superiority to sort of do what the Orient, what they wish, no, I think that this deserves to be called out. The question is, was Herzl unique and was Herzl influential? The fact is that most Zionists of the era did not deal with the issue of the Arab majority, the vast majority in Palestine. You mentioned Ahad Ha'am and Yitzhak Epstein. The numbers are actually fairly small. Leo Motzkin also mentioned it at an early Zionist Congress, but this was not something that people usually referred to. So if Herzl's opacity is significant, it's not really because of Herzl alone. It's a much bigger issue about how the early Zionist movement did not take into account and why it did not take into account the fact that 90% of the population of the land was Arab and how they dealt with it. The question then is, did Herzl have anything unusual? Was there anything unusual about his views, particularly striking? There is one diary entry you referred to where he mentions that, and this is in the midst of this sort of frenzied state that he's in, where he writes all kinds of odd things in the summer of 1895. He mentions that the inhabitants, the poor inhabitants of a future Jewish state will be spirited over the border. He seems to be thinking in economic terms and not in terms of a nationality war. But one doesn't have to look at that diary entry. Herzl did write about the Arabs throughout the Middle East and Palestinians in particular on other occasions, but not often. When he was in Egypt, he wrote that he was concerned about the plight of Felahim, and that he would, once he had the power, he would care for their needs. Now, what does that mean? It's paternalism, but he's aware of a certain issue. He was also aware of Egyptian nationalism. As he writes in a diary entry in 1903, he's in Cairo and he meets young Egyptian men whom he sees as the possible future overthrow of British rule. And yet Herzl was a great admirer of British colonialism. And he wrote with heaps of praise upon the British for their colonial administration in Egypt. So we're getting a picture of a man who might have a paternalistic belief that the West can and should be of benefit to the Orient, that the Orient is indeed backward and needs Western assistance. He refers to Palestinians very briefly when he goes to Palestine. He only went once in his whole life for 10 days. And he referred to villages being neglected, quote, in Arab fashion, end quote. And then he says that in a future Jewish state, Arabs can be employed doing things like draining swamps because they already are, because they're immune. They have herd immunity or natural immunity to disease. So he's sort of dismissing them as a future menial laboring class. But then in his novel Old New Land, published later, 1902, so 2 years before his death, one of the major characters is an Arab who is a cultured, happy individual who sees nothing but benefit in what the Jews have brought to his land. There are people who will dismiss this character as a fig leaf for colonialist aspirations, but I don't really believe that's the case, because Herzl devoted years to this novel. He loved it, and he cared about it very deeply. This novel was not a piece of propaganda. It was something else. So I'm sorry not to be able to give a definitive answer, because Herzl himself had complex and varying attitudes towards Arabs in general, Palestinian Arabs in particular. I do see a transformation over time, that if you look at what Herzl writes in 1895, it's very different from what he writes in 1902 and 1903. So we do have some sense of change over time. Does Herzl himself bear direct responsibility for the events of 1948? No, he doesn't. There were 44 years between his death and the establishment of the state. And for that reason, I am skeptical of arguments made by whether it's Rashid Khalidi or Benny Morris in his work on the Palestinian refugee problem, who will trace it all back to Herzl. We can say that Herzl had a colonialist mentality. That's one thing to say that. It's another thing to lay the blame of 1948 at his feet. I would not go that far.
So
okay, well, I have many more questions, but I think Dov is going to jump in to pass along questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you, David. And I want to thank both of you for that was a really intellectually stimulating and very thoughtful conversation. And we've received lots of excellent questions from the audience. So thank you all to the listeners for sending in those questions. I will try and condense a few, focus on a couple of the themes, because we don't have much time to give you for your answers to these questions. You've just been talking about Herzl's attitude toward the Arab question and toward the Arab inhabitants of Palestine at the time. Some of the questions have asked about his attitude toward other Jews. Specifically, what were Herzl's attitudes toward Jews in Eastern Europe, for whom he obviously became, for many, a kind of messianic figure? One of the questions notes from Lauren Lochstein that he didn't wish to translate any of the Zionist Congress's publications into Yiddish. Is that indicative of his attitude toward the Jews of Eastern Europe? And more broadly, how did he regard them? And then other questions have come in about Herzl's attitudes towards non-European Jews. You know, when writing about the Jewish question, what he had in mind was really the European Jewish question. What attitudes, if any, did he take towards Jews in the lands of the Ottoman Empire and in the Muslim world? So perhaps we can start off with them, and maybe if we have time, I'll come in with some more questions.
Oh, those are great questions. I'll answer the second part of it first. It's interesting that Herzl, no, he's not really aware of and doesn't write much about the situation of Jews in much of the Ottoman Empire. However, Herzl is very much aware of what's happening in Algeria, because Algeria at the time is an integral part of France. And even at one of the early, I think it's even in the Jewish state, he refers to Algeria. And Max Nordau, Herzl's lieutenant, Nordau himself was a great writer, journalist, playwright of the time, very much like Herzl. He also, like Herzl, had a long and flowing beard and was an impressive person. Nordau also talks quite a bit about Algeria in his own Zionist speeches. And that fit into a general diagnosis that anti-Semitism was ineradicable and that a Jewish homeland was a necessity. So he did write about Algeria. He had some contacts with a Zionist emissary in Algeria, and I think it's before the second Zionist Congress, or maybe the third. They're in conversation about bringing delegates from North Africa, from the Maghreb. And Herzl writes, well, you know, I really would love you to bring them as long as they can come in native dress. So you talk about an orientalizing perspective, that sort of sums it up. But for Eastern Europe, it's more complicated. I have seen representations of Herzl as being a condescending Western European Jew who has no respect for Eastern European Jews. And this is just not enough. First of all, Herzl famously wrote that the Eastern European Jew is not Caliban, he's Prospero. That is a source of creative energy and not a primitive life form. Herzl tended to judge people not so much by where they were from, but whether they supported him or not. If you were Herzl's ally, he respected you. It didn't matter where you were from. And it's interesting that in the often tense relationships between Herzl and Eastern European Zionist leaders, like Menachem Ussishkin, for example, who was a tough, stubborn individual who had been a Zionist leader before the era of Herzl and resented, as many Eastern European Zionists did, resented Herzl's rising to prominence while they remained in the shadows. I've never seen in Herzl's writings him dismissing Ussishkin or Ussishkin's allies as primitive or backward. He just thought they were hot-headed and they were wrong. This was a political argument. It wasn't an ethnic argument. So Herzl has respect by and large for Eastern European Jews, and you can see it when he goes to Russia in 1903 and he meets with the finance minister and the interior minister of Russia. He's near Vilna, and he goes to a Zionist meeting outside of the city. Scores of young Russian Jewish youth come to really a small hut to meet with him or to be remotely close to him, and he's deeply impressed by these people. And what's interesting is he does not use Orientalist language or condescending language in describing them. So Herzl was ultimately a politician. Eastern Europe is where his political base lay. Nor was Herzl disrespectful of Eastern European religious Jews. He writes quite a bit about what he called Wunderrebbe, the German term for a Hasidic rabbi, and how necessary it was to get them on board. Herzl, like I said, he was anti-religious, he was not religious, but not anti-religious. And he had respect for Hasidic rabbis, and he thought, well, we just get them on board with our plan and get them to support us. He cultivated relationships as best he could with Orthodox Jews in Eastern Europe. So I'm not saying that Herzl was above pettiness, because he wasn't. He could be quite petty and mean and cruel. But I don't think it was a simplistic West versus East dynamic.
Did he, another question in terms of his attitudes toward other Jews concerns his view of American Jewry. I mean, did he see American Jewry at that time? The question is more, was it more like the Budapest of his youth, a place where one could be relatively acculturated as a Jew, or was it more like Vienna, where there was more anti-Semitism? Did he see, how did he perceive American Jewry and the future of American Jewry, I suppose?
Yeah, it's interesting that he didn't really think that much about it. He was thinking primarily about, again, Zionism for him was about two things. It was about poverty and persecution. So that's Eastern European Jews, not just the Russian Empire, but also Romania, and I mentioned Algeria. Or it's about Jews who have lost their sense of honor because anti-Semitism leads them to craven assimilationism. I mentioned at the very beginning, assimilation is not a term we should use to describe Herzl. And that, for him, was issues involving Central Europe, Hungary, Austria, Germany, and so on. America didn't enter into either of those equations. Now, he did have supporters in America. I think Jacob de Haas was an early supporter. Richard Gottheil was an early supporter. The Boston Jewish Advocate, the Jewish newspaper of Boston, was founded as a sympathetic newspaper to Zionism in the early 20th century. So Zionism certainly, I mean, it had American supporters even before Herzl. But the United States was not, and this was, overlooking an important issue on his part, Zionism in America was not an important part of his equation when he thought about the Zionist movement and its needs and how it could accomplish its goals.
So we have a lot of questions. I'm going to just put to a couple more to you because I know we're running out of time. A couple of the questions have asked about the role of the Dreyfus Affair in the evolution of Herzl's Zionism. You mentioned before that that's overstated typically in kind of historical accounts. Perhaps if you could just elaborate on that a little bit. And another question, which I thought was very interesting, concerning the role of a unifying language in Herzlian Zionism, where he, why did he not pay attention in the way that other Central European intellectuals and nationalists of his time did to the need to have a unifying language. And you mentioned that it's quite astounding that for somebody, and this is my add-on, for somebody who spoke so many languages, right, was a great linguist and yet failed to learn Hebrew. So what accounts for his, was it a blind spot with regards to the role that language plays in Jewish nationalism, and particularly as a unifying means of unifying the Jewish nation?
Right. Well, about language, Herzl in Old Newland is asked, or a newcomer to the country who's very much an alter ego of Herzl, asked, what language do you speak? And they say, we speak every language. We speak all languages, even though Herzl's characters all speak in German, and Rashid Bey, the Palestinian character in the novel, speaks fluent German with, quote, a slight northern accent. So his German is that good. I think Herzl, like a lot of Zionists of his era, was uncomfortable with Yiddish, not because it was a Jewish language, but precisely because of its proximity to German, and the usual prejudices that people in the German-speaking world, Jews in the German-speaking world, sometimes had about Yiddish as a lower form or a bastardized form of German. Although there is a body of literature that shows that Herzlian Zionism was actually much more open to Yiddish than one might think, and that the Zionist movement, which was very much devoted to cultural as well as diplomatic initiatives, supported all sorts of publications in Yiddish as well as Hebrew. Herzl wasn't necessarily a great enemy of Yiddish, even if personally. And by the way, he used Yiddish in his diaries. He didn't speak it, but he used Yiddish phrases. So as far as Hebrew goes, no, it's true. Herzl never went beyond the smattering of Hebrew he learned as a child. But one thing Herzl writes about, again, in the diaries, which are quite perceptive, he writes about how we Jews, we do not possess uniformity of language. He just says that flat out. We do not possess uniformity of race. There's no such thing as a Jewish race. We do not have university of language. There's a beautiful moment, I think it's at the Second Zionist Congress, where he says, we are a people, we share a common history, we share a common future, we share a common fate, the concept of what's called in German Schicksalgemeinschaft, common fate, and we are bound by a common foe. He says, isn't that enough? Doesn't that suffice to define us as a nation? So we don't need the linguistic part. And then finally, to finish up about the Dreyfus Affair, there's a whole book to be written about why the Dreyfus Affair has become so closely associated with Herzl, because he himself doesn't even mention Dreyfus in his diary until a year and a half after he's become a Zionist. He reported on the Dreyfus trial, arrest and trial for his newspaper. He reported about it in very, I'd say, matter-of-fact tones. Herzl himself may have been deeply affected inside, but his private writings, his diaries, his letters don't indicate that. It seems that Herzl was much more concerned about anti-Semitism in Vienna, which was, after all, his home city. He was sojourning in Paris, but Vienna was his home. And the anti-Semitic mayor, Karl Lueger, the anti-Semitic Christian social movement, sent him into despondency. I'm not saying he wasn't aware of anti-Semitism in France. He was. And he wrote his play, the New Ghetto, which is all about anti-Semitism, while he was in Paris. But he finished the play 3 weeks before Dreyfus's arrest was publicized. So the Dreyfus Affair certainly played its role, but I think that Herzl himself invented or misremembered that role when in 1899 he wrote an essay claiming that the Dreyfus Affair had turned him into a Zionist. But when you actually look at the evidence from 1894-95, that's not what appears. Herzl may have been intentionally fabricating, which some scholars have said. I prefer to think that he was misremembering, the way that people often misremember things, especially if it gives their past activities, their past actions, a bit more glory, if it puts it in a grander context. And what could have been grander than the Dreyfus Affair, which was simply splitting France at half at the time. So I don't think it was fabrication. It may have been simply misremembering.
Thank you, Derek. I guess one last question we have time for, a very quick one. What do you make of the diary entry in which Herzl pondered the mass conversion of Jews into Christianity? This is also something that is often seen as emblematic of his assimilation, which you've kind of pushed back against the notion that of Herzl as an assimilated Jew. So what do you make of that? Was it just a kind of offbeat musing, or is it something that gives us more of a window into Herzl's thinking?
Well, it kind of sums up some of the things we've talked about today, in that on the one level, it's insane, it's crazy, and Herzl himself was a man who sometimes there is a fine line between enthusiasm and vision and, insanity, and Herzl himself was aware of that. In 1893, he is already thinking a lot about anti-Semitism. This is before Dreyfus and before Karl Lueger. He comes up with this scheme after he has been the object of an anti-Semitic insult, that the Jews should convert to Christianity en masse. There'd be a big ceremony at Stephan's Cathedral in Vienna with the Pope present, and that there would be a mass conversion. But, okay, it's a crazy idea, but what's even more interesting is Herzl writes he himself would never convert. Out of filial piety, he would not convert, and out of a sense of honor. So he will stay Jewish. The other thing is, in a way, and this, David Meyers can talk about this with much more expert knowledge than I can about the heritage of 1492 and 1497, but what could be more Jewish than a whole bunch of Jews converting en masse to Christianity? Because then they become Jewish converts. They become conversos. They're not simply Christians. And it's an act, it's a theatrical act that he is envisioning. And he brought this idea to his newspaper editors, who were both Jewish, and they looked at him with horror, like, what are you talking about? And he dropped the idea. But it just shows you in a way how desperate he was, how much anti-Semitism bothered him. It shows you how his theatricality could manifest itself in political activity, which the Zionist movement was filled with, the symbols of Zionism that he created. It shows you that he was a man striving to solve the Jewish problem any way he could. And he came up with all kinds of harebrained schemes. And then he came upon Zionism, which many Jews also viewed as a harebrained scheme. But it did bring him what he was looking for. He was a man looking for a project, and he devoted the rest of his short life to that project.
Well, with that, I think that's an appropriate moment to end this. I want to thank you, Derek, for that really illuminating discussion, and David, about Herzl, and about not only about Herzl's life and importance to Zionism, but also Herzl's legacy in Israel today and what that legacy consists of. I know I've really enjoyed listening to both of you. I want to thank you, and I want to thank all the audience out there for listening. I'm sorry we didn't have time for more of your questions. We will look over those questions. And thank you all for joining us, and hopefully you will join us again for future webinars from the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. Thank you, Professor Penslar. Thank you, Professor Meyers. And I hope to see you all again in person, perhaps, in some point in the future. Thank you.
Alavai. Thank you. Thank you both.
Hi there.